I've never been a superstitious person. In fact, I used to tease my neighbor Dorothy every time I saw her leave her house on Tuesdays and Thursdays with that lucky charm dangling around her neck. "Today's the day, Mary. I can feel it," she'd say as she passed by my window on her way to the local lottery office. I would only smile and shake my head, wondering how much money she had already wasted on that ridiculous habit. My routine was simple and predictable. I worked as an administrative assistant at a small law firm in downtown Valencia. Every day was almost the same as the one before, waking up early, making breakfast for Martin, my husband, and me, then catching the bus to work. In the evenings, I'd return home, make dinner, and wait for Martin to come back from his job at the factory. On weekends, we usually visited his mother, Claire, who lived in a nearby town. A normal, unremarkable life. That June night didn't seem any different from the others. It had been a hot, exhausting day at the office, the air conditioning had broken down, and the technician wasn't scheduled to arrive until the following week. I arrived home sweating, with my hair plastered to my forehead, longing for a cold shower. Martin still wasn't home. Lately, he had been doing overtime at the factory to help pay off some debts. While I waited for dinner to warm up in the microwave, I decided to turn on the TV to distract myself. I absent-mindedly flipped through the channels until something caught my eye, the National Lottery drawing. I normally wouldn't even bother to watch it, but that night, for some reason, I found myself staring at the screen. The numbers started to appear one by one. 5, 13, 24, 36, 42, 48. My heart skipped a beat. Weren't those? No, it couldn't be. I dashed to the kitchen where I'd left my purse. With trembling hands, I pulled out a crumpled ticket that I'd bought almost out of obligation at the corner newsstand a few weeks ago, a ticket I had completely forgotten about until that moment. I returned to the living room just as the winning numbers were being replayed. I compared them to my ticket once, twice, 3 times. I couldn't believe it. They were exactly the same. My breathing quickened, and I felt as if I couldn't get enough air. I collapsed onto the sofa, clutching the ticket as if I feared it might vanish. 85 million euros. The figure whirled in my mind like a tempest. It was an amount of money I could barely imagine. How many zeros did it have? I tried to do the mental math, but my brain went blank. I sprang up and ran to the bathroom. I needed to see myself in the mirror to check that I was still me. The woman who looked back had wide, startled eyes and flushed cheeks. She seemed like a completely different person. "I'm a millionaire," I whispered to my reflection, as if saying it aloud might make it more real. But along with the initial euphoria came fear. What was I supposed to do with so much money? How would I manage it? I had never had more than just enough to get by. Debts had always been a constant in our lives: the rent, the bills, the car loan. Every month was a struggle to make ends meet. And now, suddenly, in my hands was the solution to all our financial problems. I thought of Martin. How would I tell him? He had always been a dreamer, always talking about the businesses he'd start if he had the capital. But the truth was, he had never been very good with money. I recalled the times he'd tried to invest our meager savings in schemes promising quick returns, only to lose it all. How would he react to this news? And then there was Claire, my mother-in-law. She had moved in with us a few months ago after being evicted from her apartment for not being able to pay the rent. She'd claimed it was temporary until she found a job, but as the months passed, she was still here, squandering the little money we had on her investments in beauty products she could never sell. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, my head in my hands. Should I keep the secret? Hide it from everyone and calmly plan my next move? The idea was tempting. I could vanish, start a new life somewhere no one knew me. Be rich, free, unburdened. But no, I couldn't do that to Martin. Despite his flaws, he was my husband, my partner. We had weathered tough times together and built a life as a team. I couldn't just abandon him. I decided I'd tell him when he got home. Together, we could make responsible decisions. This was our chance to change our lives forever, to do things right this time. I left the bathroom and returned to the living room. The smell of burnt food reminded me that I'd left dinner in the microwave too long. I rescued it quickly, but it was too late. The chicken was dry and as tough as shoe leather. It didn't matter. I wasn't hungry anyway tonight. I sat on the sofa, waiting for Martin, with the lottery ticket safely tucked in the pocket of my robe. The clock's hands seemed to crawl by. Every noise from outside made me jump, thinking it was him arriving. Finally, around 10 o'clock, I heard the sound of keys in the lock. My heart began pounding. This was the moment. Our lives were about to change forever. Martin entered our apartment looking tired. He had dark circles under his eyes, his shirt wrinkled and stained with grease. "Hi, sweetheart," he murmured as he dropped his bag on the floor. "What's for dinner?" I rose from the sofa, my legs trembling. "Martin," I said, my voice firmer than I expected, "we need to talk. Something incredible has happened." He looked at me curiously, perhaps sensing something unusual in my tone. He sat down, and I joined him, pulling the lottery ticket out of my robe pocket. "Do you remember this ticket?" I asked, showing it to him. "I bought it a few weeks ago at the corner newsstand." Martin nodded slowly, not quite understanding where I was headed. "Well," I continued, taking a deep breath, "I just saw the drawing on TV. And we've won, Martin. We've hit the jackpot." There was a moment of utter silence. Martin stared at me as if he hadn't heard a word. Then, suddenly, he burst into laughter. "Good one, Mary," he said between chuckles. "I almost believed you. This is a joke, right? Where's the hidden camera?" "It's not a joke," I insisted, a mix of frustration and excitement churning within me. "It's real, Martin. We've won 85 million euros. Martin's laughter slowly faded as he saw the seriousness on my face. He took the ticket from my hands and examined it carefully, comparing it with the numbers still flashing on the TV screen. "My God," he finally whispered. "It's true. It really is." In an instant, he jumped to his feet and pulled me up with him. He began running around the room, laughing and shouting with joy. He hugged me tightly, lifting me off the ground and spinning me around. "We're rich, Mary. Rich," he yelled repeatedly. His enthusiasm was contagious. Soon I found myself laughing and crying at the same time, letting all the tension and disbelief of the past few hours dissolve into a sea of shared joy. Just then, the guest room door creaked open and Claire appeared, her hair disheveled and her face still half asleep. "What's all this commotion?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. Martin rushed to her and embraced her, lifting her off the floor just as he had done with me. "Mom, we're rich," he exclaimed. "Mary has won the lottery." Claire looked at us both in confusion, as if thinking we'd gone mad. But when Martin showed her the ticket and explained what had happened, her expression changed. Her eyes lit up and a smile spread across her face. "This is a miracle," she declared, joining in our celebration. The three of us embraced in the center of the living room, laughing and crying, making plans for the future. In that moment, all my doubts and worries seemed to vanish. We were united, a family, and together we would face whatever came our way. But as Martin and Claire excitedly discussed trips and new houses, a small voice in the back of my mind reminded me to be cautious. Money could be a blessing, but it could also be a curse if not handled wisely. That night, while Martin and Claire continued celebrating in the living room, I slipped away to the guest room under the pretext of needing some rest. I sat on the bed, holding the lottery ticket in my hands, and promised myself that I would do everything possible to ensure this unexpected fortune became a positive force in our lives. As sleep finally overtook me, I couldn't help but wonder, how would this change our lives? Would we be prepared to manage such wealth? Only time would tell. For now, I allowed myself to savor the feeling that, for the first time in a long while, the future seemed bright and full of possibilities. The next morning, I woke up feeling as if everything had been a dream. Sunlight streamed through the slats of the blinds, bathing the bedroom in a golden light that seemed to foreshadow the changes to come. I turned over in bed, searching for Martin, but his side was empty. Then I heard voices coming from the kitchen, and reality hit me once again. It was true. We had won the lottery. I got up and put on my robe, noticing that my hands were still trembling slightly. As I walked toward the kitchen, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the corridor. When I entered, I saw Martin and Claire sitting at the table, talking quietly but excitedly. Both looked up as I came in, their faces lighting up with smiles that seemed too wide, too enthusiastic. "Good morning, millionaire," Martin exclaimed as he got up to give me a kiss. His breath smelled of coffee and, oddly enough, of cigarettes he had supposedly quit years ago, but apparently had indulged in again in the excitement of the moment. Claire came over and gave me a tight hug. "Oh, Mary, I still can't believe it. What a blessing! God has heard our prayers." I sat down at the table, feeling a bit overwhelmed by their morning exuberance. Martin poured me a cup of coffee and sat back down, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "We've been talking, Mary," he began, his eyes sparkling with an excitement I hadn't seen in years. "We have so many ideas, so many plans. Where should we start? How about a trip? We could go to the Maldives, or maybe New York. You've always wanted to see the Statue of Liberty, haven't you?" Before I could answer, Claire interjected, "Or we could buy that beach house we've always dreamed about. Imagine, Mary, waking up every morning to the sound of waves. We could even have one for each of us if we wanted." Her words took my breath away. A house for everyone? A trip to the Maldives? It seemed they had no idea of the real value of the money, even of such a vast sum. "Wait a minute," I said, raising my hands. "I think we need to take things slowly. First, we have to claim the prize, and then we need to carefully think about how we're going to manage all this." Martin frowned. "What do you mean by manage?" "It's our money. We can do whatever we want with it." I felt a pang of unease at his tone. "Yes, it's our money," I said cautiously, "but that doesn't mean we should spend it all at once. We need to be smart about it, Martin. Think about our future." Claire let out a laugh that sounded a bit forced. "Oh, Mary, always so cautious. But now we're rich. We don't have to worry about the future. We can just live in the moment and enjoy life for once." I looked at my mother-in-law, noticing for the first time the wrinkles around her eyes and the early strands of gray at her temples. She had spent most of her life struggling to make ends meet, just like us. I understood her desire to enjoy life, to give in to excitement. But someone had to keep our feet on the ground. "Listen," I said, trying to sound reasonable, "of course we're going to enjoy this money. But we also have to be responsible. We could invest a part of it to secure our future and our children's future if we decide to have them." Martin leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Invest? In what? Stocks? Government bonds? That's boring, Mary. We have a chance to do something big, something of our own." My heart raced. I recognized that look in Martin's eyes. It was the same look he got every time one of his big ideas came up, ideas that invariably ended in disaster. "What are you thinking, Martin?" I asked, dreading his answer. He smiled, leaning forward again. "A restaurant," he said enthusiastically. "No, even better, a chain of restaurants. You've always been an amazing cook, Mary. Imagine, we could open the first one right here in Valencia, then expand to Madrid, Barcelona, maybe even internationally." Claire clapped, her face lighting up. "Oh, yes. It could be a family business. I could take care of the decor. I've always had an eye for those things." I looked at them both, feeling a mix of disbelief and frustration. How could they be making such grand plans without even having claimed the prize? Without any idea of how to run a business? "Martin, Claire," I said, trying to keep my cool, "opening a restaurant is much more complicated than you think. It requires experience, management skills, a solid business plan. We can't just dive into something like that without proper planning." Martin got up from his chair and began pacing in the kitchen. "Why do you always have to be so negative, Mary? This is our opportunity. We can hire people who know what they're doing. With the money we have, we can make it work." I felt frustration welling up inside me. "It's not about being negative, Martin. It's about being realistic. Remember when you invested our savings in that coffee import business? Or when Claire lost all her money in that multi-level scheme?" Claire stiffened in her chair. "That was different," she said tensely. "We didn't have the resources we have now." "Exactly," I replied. "And that's why we need to be even more careful. The more you have, the more you can lose." Martin stopped in his tracks and turned to look at me, his expression a mix of disappointment and something else, resentment, perhaps. I can't believe what I'm hearing, he said in a low, dangerous voice. We won the lottery, our chance to change our lives forever, and you want us to keep living like nothing's changed? Tears threatened to well up in my eyes, but I held them back. I'm not saying we should do nothing, Martin. I just want us to be prudent, to think carefully before making decisions that could affect our future. Claire stood up and placed a hand on Martin's shoulder. Maybe we should give Mary some time to get used to the idea, she said in a tone meant to be conciliatory, but that came off as condescending. It's a huge change, after all. Some of us need more time to adjust. I felt anger rising inside me. How do they treat me as if I were irrational? But before I could say another word, Martin nodded. You're right, Mom, he said. Let's go for a walk, get some fresh air. Mary, when we come back, I hope you'll reconsider your position. And with that, they left the kitchen, leaving me alone with my cold cup of coffee and a growing sense of unease in my stomach. I sat in the kitchen for what felt like hours, trying to process everything that had happened. How had we gone from last night's joy and celebration to this? It felt as if I had woken up in a different world, a world where money had transformed the people I loved into greedy strangers. Finally, I got up and went to the living room. The lottery ticket still lay on the coffee table where we'd left it the night before. I picked it up, staring at the numbers that had changed our lives. Was this a blessing or a curse? I decided I needed some fresh air, just like Martin and Claire. I left the apartment and wandered aimlessly through the streets of Valencia. The morning sun warmed the sidewalks, and the aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from the bakeries. People passed by, absorbed in their daily routines, unaware that among them walked a woman who had just won millions. I arrived at the Central Market, a modernist building filled with stalls selling fruits, vegetables, meats, and fish. I used to come here every week to shop, haggling for the best prices and counting every penny. Now, I gazed at luxury products, caviar, truffles, oysters, and realized I could buy the whole market if I wanted to. But that wasn't what I wanted. I didn't desire a life of excessive luxury and uncontrolled spending. I wanted security, stability, and the ability to help others. I wanted to use this money for good, not just to satisfy fleeting whims. As I walked back home, I made up my mind. I would talk with Martin and Claire and try to make them understand my point of view. And if I couldn't, well, I'd have to consider other options. When I returned to the apartment, Martin and Claire were already back. They were seated on the sofa, with papers scattered over the coffee table. Martin looked up as I entered, and I saw that his expression had softened. Mary, he said as he got up, I'm sorry for how I behaved earlier. You're right, we need to think this through calmly. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Perhaps, after all, we could handle this together. Thank you, Martin, I said, moving closer to give him a hug. I'm sorry too. I know you're excited and you're right to want to seize this opportunity. Claire cleared her throat. We've done some calculations, she said, indicating the papers on the table. I think we've found a compromise that could work for all of us. I sat down with them, ready to listen. Over the next few hours, we discussed plans, made lists, and considered options. We didn't agree on everything, but at least we were talking, really listening to each other. By the end of the day, we'd reached a provisional agreement. We would invest a substantial portion of the money in a safe fund for our future. Another portion would be used to improve our immediate lives, a new home, a few modest trips. And yes, we'd set aside some money to explore the restaurant idea, but only on the condition that we hired professionals to help plan it properly. As we prepared for bed that night, I felt that I'd regained some control over the situation. Yet a small voice in the back of my mind kept warning me to be careful. Money had the power to change people, and this was only the beginning of our new life. I looked at Martin, already asleep beside me, and wondered if we were truly ready for what lay ahead. Only time would tell. For now, all I could do was stand by my decision and hope that, eventually, Martin and Claire would understand that I'd done it for all of our sakes. The days following our initial discussion about the money passed in a haze of conflicting emotions. On one hand, I felt a bubbling excitement every time I thought of the possibilities opening up for us. On the other, Anxiety gnawed at me every time Martin or Claire mentioned some extravagant plan. One morning, while we were having breakfast on the terrace of our modest apartment in the Carmen district, Martin dropped a bombshell that would change everything. "I've been thinking," he said, stirring his coffee more energetically than necessary, "that we should invest most of the money in the restaurant business. The sooner we start, the better." I felt as if the croissant I was eating had suddenly turned into a heavy mass in my stomach. "But Martin, we agreed to use only a part of it to explore that idea," I reminded him, trying to keep my voice steady. Claire, who was watering the plants on the terrace, turned toward us with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mary, darling, you have to understand that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We can't waste it by being overly cautious." I took a deep breath and counted to 10 in my head before replying. "It's not about being cautious, it's about being sensible. None of us has any experience in the restaurant business. Don't you think we should start small?" Martin scoffed. "Small? Mary, we've got 85 million euros. We don't need to take baby steps. We can hire the best chefs and managers. We can make this work." I looked at my husband, trying to remember the man I had married. Where was the cautious Martin who cared about our future? When had he become this risk-taking gambler willing to bet it all? "Listen," I said, trying a new approach, "why don't we talk to a financial advisor first? Someone who can help us better understand our options." Claire let out a dismissive laugh. "A financial advisor? For what? To tell us how to spend our own money? We don't need anyone telling us what to do, Mary. We're perfectly capable of making our own decisions." Frustration surged within me. How could they be so blind? Didn't they see the risks of diving headfirst into a business they knew nothing about? "All right," I said, standing up from the table. "I'm going for a walk. I need to think." I left the apartment without looking back, ignoring Martin's calls. I wandered the narrow streets of our neighborhood, my thoughts a whirlwind of worry and confusion. I eventually reached Plaza de la Virgen, the historic heart of Valencia. I sat on the edge of the fountain, watching the water cascade down, forming patterns that evoked the ancient irrigation channels of the region. The sound of the water was soothing, and gradually my mind began to clear. I recalled my grandmother's words, passed down before she died. "Mary, money is like water. It can nourish and give life if used wisely, but it can also sweep away everything if left uncontrolled." At that moment, I made a decision. I couldn't let this unexpected fortune destroy everything we had built. I had to protect us, even if it meant confronting Martin and Claire. I returned home with determination. I found Martin and Claire in the living room, huddled over a mess of papers spread across the coffee table. They looked up as I entered, anticipation in their eyes. "I've made up my mind," I announced, my voice firmer than I felt. "We're not going to invest most of the money in the restaurant business." A deafening silence followed my words. Martin was the first to break it. "What do you mean, we're not investing?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Mary, we've already talked about this. It's an incredible opportunity." "No, Martin," I said, holding my ground. "You brought it up. I've listened, and the more I hear, the more I realize that it's a dangerous idea." Claire stood up, her face flushing with indignation. "How dare you? This is a family dream. How can you be so selfish?" Anger surged within me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "It's not about selfishness, Claire. It's about responsibility. None of us knows anything about running a restaurant, let alone a chain. What if it fails? What if we lose everything?" Martin ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he always made when frustrated. "But that's the point, Mary. With that much money, how could we possibly fail?" Easily, I replied. "Money doesn't guarantee success. In fact, having too much can lead us to make even bigger mistakes." "So what do you suggest?" Martin asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "That we just sit on our money and do nothing?" I took a deep breath. "No, I suggest we be smart about it. I propose we divide the money into 3 parts." That caught their attention. Claire sat back down and Martin leaned forward, intrigued. "The first part," I continued, "will invest in something secure, government bonds or low-risk investment funds. Something that guarantees us a stable income in the long run." Martin nodded slowly, though I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. The second part, I said, we'll use to improve our lives, buy a new home, take a few modest trips, maybe even donate to causes we care about. Claire smiled at that, probably already picturing her dream house. And the third part, I concluded, we'll reserve for business opportunities. But, and I add this quickly, seeing Martin's excitement, only after thorough research and consultation with experts. And not all in one venture. We'll diversify our investments to minimize risk. There was a pause as Martin and Claire processed my words. Finally, Martin spoke. It sounds reasonable, he admitted reluctantly. But what about our dream of a restaurant? I'm not saying we can't do it, I replied. I just think we should take it slowly. Maybe we could start with one restaurant and see how it goes before thinking about a chain. Claire crossed her arms, her face a mask of disappointment. I thought we were a family, that we'd make these decisions together. A twinge of guilt struck me, but I remained firm. We are a family, Claire. And that's exactly why I have to consider what's best for all of us in the long run. Martin got up and began pacing the room. I could see a whirlwind of emotions on his face, disappointment, frustration, and perhaps a glimmer of understanding. And if we don't agree with your plan, he finally asked. I took a deep breath. The ticket is in my name, Martin, I said quietly but firmly. Legally, the final decision is mine. But I don't want it to be that way. I want us to decide together. I saw understanding slowly dawn in his eyes. For a moment, I feared he might explode in anger. Instead, he sank heavily back onto the sofa. You're right, he whispered. I got carried away by the excitement. Your plan makes sense. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I moved toward him and took his hand. Thank you for understanding, Martin. I promise I'm not trying to crush your dreams. I just want us to achieve them in a way that doesn't jeopardize our future. Yet Claire still wasn't convinced. She abruptly stood up, her eyes flashing with a mix of disappointment and something that bordered on hatred. Fine, she said coldly. If that's how it's going to be, I'm going to my room. I don't want any part of this. I watched her storm off, her footsteps echoing down the hall until her door slammed shut. Martin and I sat in silence for a moment, the tension hanging heavily in the air. Do you think we did the right thing? Martin finally asked, his voice laden with doubt. I nodded slowly. I think so. It won't be easy, but in the long run, I believe we'll all be better off. That night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, I replayed the day's events over and over. I had made my first major decision regarding the money, and though I was convinced it was right, I couldn't shake a nagging sense of unease. Had I done the right thing by confronting Martin and Claire? Had I been too harsh? Too controlling? Doubts swirled in the darkness, but every time I was about to give in, I remembered my grandmother's words about money and water. I looked at Martin, asleep beside me, and wondered how this would affect our marriage. Could we overcome this trial? Or would money ultimately tear us apart? Only time would tell. For now, all I could do was stand by my decision and hope that, eventually, Martin and Claire would understand that I did it for all our sakes. In the days following my decision, every step felt like walking on broken glass. Every conversation was laden with barely concealed tension and resentment. Martin had become distant, spending long hours out, thinking things over. Claire, for her part, oscillated between accusatory silences and biting remarks about my supposed lack of family spirit. One morning, while I was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, I heard Martin and Claire whispering in the living room. I crept silently to the door, feeling a twinge of guilt for eavesdropping, but worry overcame any sense of privacy. We can't let her get away with it, I heard Claire say in a furious hiss. This is our money too, Martin. She can't control everything by herself. I know, Mom, Martin replied, his voice tired yet determined. But what can we do? Legally, the ticket is in her name. There was a pause, then Claire spoke again in a low, dangerous tone. There's always a way, son. There always is. My heart pounded as I stepped away from the door. What were they planning? Paranoia crept in as I imagined all sorts of terrible scenarios. Were they capable of hurting me over the money? Did the love in my family really come with a price? That afternoon, while Martin and Claire were out, I went to the bank and opened a safety deposit box. I placed the original lottery ticket there, along with other important documents. I also created a set of decoy documents, copies that looked authentic but had no real value. I stashed them at home, exactly where the real ticket used to be. The days passed, and the tension at home became almost unbearable. Martin barely looked me in the eye, and Claire spent most of her time locked in her room, emerging only to cast reproachful glances in my direction. I felt like a stranger in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder, dreading what they might be planning. One afternoon, I decided to go grocery shopping, desperate for a break from the suffocating atmosphere at home. As I wandered the aisles of the supermarket, mechanically selecting fruits and vegetables, I couldn't stop thinking about how everything had changed. How could something that was supposed to be a blessing turn into a nightmare? I returned home a few hours later, arms laden with bags. Approaching our apartment door, a sharp, acrid smell hit me, smoke. My heart raced as I flung the door open, dreading the worst. What I saw left me paralyzed. In the backyard, visible through the living room's glass door, Martin and Claire were gathered around a small fire. Smoke curled upward in gray spirals against the afternoon sky, and I could see charred pieces of paper floating in the air. I dropped my shopping bags and ran toward them, panic overwhelming me. "What are you doing?" I screamed, my voice breaking with fear and disbelief. Martin turned toward me, his face set in a mask of cold determination. In his hands, he held what remained of an envelope, its edges licked by flames. "What we should have done from the start," he said in a flat, emotionless tone. "If you can't share, then nobody gets it." Claire stood beside him, a cruel smile of satisfaction on her face. "It's a pity, Mary," she said, her voice dripping with feigned sympathy. "If you had been more reasonable, we wouldn't have had to go this far." My mind reeled as I tried to process what I was witnessing. Then it hit me. They believed they were burning the lottery ticket, destroying our fortune in an act of twisted revenge. For a moment, I felt as if the world were crumbling around me. Everything I'd fought for, everything I'd tried to protect, seemed to be turning to ashes before my eyes. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of the panic and despair I anticipated, a surprising calm settled over me. I looked at Martin and Claire, their faces illuminated by the dying flames, and felt a mixture of sorrow and relief. Sorrow for what was lost, for the broken trust and betrayed love. But also relief, because in that moment of crisis, the truth was finally revealed. "Do you really think that's the real ticket?" I asked, my voice calm and measured. Martin frowned, doubt flickering in his eyes for the first time. "What do you mean?" "Of course it is. We found it right where you always kept it." I shook my head, a sad smile forming on my lips. "Oh, Martin, did you really think I'd be so careless? That isn't the real ticket, it's a copy." Claire stepped forward, her face contorted in anger. "You're lying," she screamed. "You're trying to fool us." "No, Claire," I replied, feeling a strength I hadn't known I possessed. "You were the ones trying to deceive me. I protected you both. The real ticket is safe, well out of your reach." I saw the realization spread across their faces, quickly followed by shock and shame. Martin dropped the burnt remains of the envelope, his hands trembling. "Why?" he whispered. "Why did you do this?" "Because I had to protect us," I answered, the weight of my words settling between us. Not just from the outside world, but from ourselves, what money could do to us. Claire slumped into a chair on the patio, all her earlier bravado gone. "So, was it all for nothing then?" she murmured, more to herself than to us. "No," I said, stepping closer. "It wasn't for nothing. It showed us the truth. It revealed what we've become, what money has done to us." Martin looked at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimpse of the man I'd married. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Mary." I don't know what I was thinking. I wanted to embrace him, to comfort him, to tell him everything would be all right. But I knew things had changed irrevocably. Trust had been shattered, and I wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. "I'm sorry too, Martin," I said softly. "I hate that we've come to this. But now we have to decide what comes next." Claire looked up, tears unspilled in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Is there still an us after all this? I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. That depends on you. The money is still there waiting. But before we can even think about using it, we need to fix what's broken. We have to decide what kind of people we want to be, with or without 85 million euros. For a long moment, silence reigned, broken only by the crackle of the last embers of the fire. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, a beautiful contrast to the scene of destruction in our backyard. Finally, Martin spoke. "You're right," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "We've lost our way, each of us. But how can we fix this?" "It won't be easy," I replied, feeling the enormity of the task before us. "We'll need help, family therapy perhaps. And we'll have to be brutally honest with each other, really honest, for the first time in a long while." Claire nodded slowly, appearing smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. "I suppose it's a start," she murmured. As the sun set and shadows stretched across our patio, I realized we were at a crossroads. The fire had burned more than worthless papers. It had scorched away the illusion of who we were, exposing the raw, painful truth beneath. But perhaps, from the ashes of that destruction, we could build something new. Something stronger, more honest, more valuable than any amount of money. I looked at Martin and Claire, their faces softened by the fading light, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with uncomfortable conversations and painful truths. But at least now we were being honest. The money was still there, waiting. But now we knew we had to fix ourselves before we could even think about using it. And maybe in the process, we discovered that the true treasure wasn't in a bank account, but in the family we could become. As we stepped back inside, leaving behind the ashes of our betrayal, I realized this wasn't the end of our story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one we would write together, with honesty and hope. The morning after the fire dawned gray and rainy, as if the Valencia sky itself reflected the mood of our home. I woke up early, unable to sleep any longer, haunted by the events of the previous day. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, a constant reminder of how close we'd come to losing everything. While I was making coffee in the kitchen, I heard tentative footsteps approaching. Martin appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled and dark circles under his eyes. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw shame and remorse etched on his face. "Good morning," I murmured, offering him a cup of coffee. He accepted it silently and sat down at the kitchen table. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unsaid words and repressed emotions. Finally, Martin broke the silence. "Mary," he began, his voice husky, "about yesterday. I don't know how to start apologizing. What I did, is unforgivable." I nodded slowly, taking a sip of my coffee. "You're right, Martin. What you and Claire did was unforgivable. But I think it's time we spoke completely honestly. There are things I need to explain to both of you." As if summoned by my words, Claire appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked pale and worn, as if she'd aged 10 years in one night. Without a word, she sat at the table with us. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for what I was about to reveal. "What I told you yesterday about the lottery ticket is true. What you burned was a copy. But there's more you need to know." Martin and Claire looked at me, anticipation and fear mingling in their eyes. "The day I won the lottery," I continued, "I was thrilled, happy, but also scared. Scared of how this money could change us. And I was right to be." I got up and went to my room, returning with a folder full of documents. I placed it on the table in front of them. "This," I said, pointing to the folder, "is the plan I set in motion the day after I won the lottery. Before telling you anything, I met with a lawyer and a financial advisor. Together, we created an airtight trust." I opened the folder and began showing them the documents one by one. The original lottery ticket is secured in a safety deposit box at the bank. The prize money is in a special account that can only be accessed under very specific conditions. I watched their eyes widen as they read through the papers. Claire was the first to speak. "What does all this mean, Mary? What are these conditions?" I sipped my coffee, bracing myself for the hardest part. "It means the money is protected. None of us can touch it unless we all agree. And there are specific clauses that prevent it from being used for risky ventures or extravagant expenses without the unanimous approval of an advisory board. Martin dropped the papers he was holding. But why? Why do all this in secret? Because I was afraid, Martin, I said, feeling a weight lift at finally telling the truth. Afraid of what money could do to us. And the past few days have proven my fears weren't unfounded. Claire abruptly stood, her chair screeching against the tile floor. So you deceived us? All this time. I remained calm, locking eyes with her. No, Claire. I protected you both. I protected you from yourselves, the greed and impulsiveness this money awakened in us. Martin shook his head in disbelief. But all the arguments, the restaurant plans, was it all just a farce? No, I replied softly. Those arguments were real. I wanted to see how we'd handle the situation, how we'd react to having so much money. And what I saw convinced me I had made the right decision. Silence settled over the kitchen as Martin and Claire absorbed my words. I could see shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, a slow understanding cross their faces. So, Martin said slowly, what happens now with the money? I sat down again, looking at both of them. That depends on us, on whether we can overcome this, on whether we can learn to trust each other again. The trust includes provisions for family therapy and financial education. If we really want to use this money, we have to prove we can manage it responsibly. Claire slumped back into her chair, all her earlier bluster gone. And if we can't? If we can't overcome this? Then the money stays untouched, I replied simply. Locked away until we're ready, or until we decide to donate it all to charity. Martin looked at me, a new respect shining in his eyes. All this time. I thought you were being selfish, controlling. But you were trying to save us. I nodded, tears prickling at my eyes. I love you both. I love our family, and I'd do anything to protect it, even if that means protecting it from ourselves. Claire stood up again, but this time she approached me slowly. For a moment, I feared she would scream or even hit me. Instead, she did something that completely surprised me. She embraced me. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. I'm so sorry, Mary. I've been a foolish, selfish woman. I returned her hug, feeling something unlock in my chest. Martin joined us, and for a moment we just stayed like that, holding each other as tears flowed freely. When we finally pulled apart, I saw in Martin's and Claire's eyes something I hadn't seen in weeks: hope. So, Martin asked, what do we do now? I smiled, feeling for the first time in a long while that we were on the right track. Now we start over. Together. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and difficult conversations. We reached out to a family therapist recommended by my lawyer and began the arduous process of rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. It wasn't easy. There were moments of renewed anger and frustration when old resentments surfaced. But gradually, session by session, we began to truly communicate, listening to one another in a way we hadn't done in years. Martin was the first to step forward. One evening, after an especially intense session, he found me on the terrace, gazing at the city lights. I've been thinking, he said, joining me at the railing, about the restaurant, about all those big plans I had. I held my breath, dreading that he might reopen old wounds. But then he surprised me. They were crazy, he admitted with a soft laugh. I don't know anything about running a restaurant. I was so blinded by the idea of money that I couldn't see how absurd it was. I took his hand, feeling a surge of affection for the man who, despite everything, was still the love of my life. They weren't crazy, Martin. They were dreams. And dreams matter. Maybe someday, when we're ready, we can revisit that idea. But the right way, step by step. He squeezed my hand. You're right. And thank you for not letting it all fall apart. Claire, too, showed signs of change. One morning, I found her poring over brochures for financial education courses. I've been wasting my life, she told me when I asked. Relying on others, spending money I never had. It's time I learned to be responsible. I felt a swell of pride for my mother-in-law. That's wonderful, Claire. And you know you have all our support. As the weeks passed, I sensed a fundamental shift in our family dynamic. The money, which had once been a source of conflict and division, had become a catalyst for growth and unity. One evening after dinner, we all sat together in the living room. It was time to make some decisions about our future. "I've been thinking," I said, looking at Martin and Claire, "maybe it's time we consider using a small portion of the money." I saw their eyes light up, but this time not with greed, rather with a quiet, mature excitement. "What do you have in mind?" Martin asked. "Well," I continued, "Claire's been working hard on her finance courses. I thought we could help her start a small business. Something modest that she can manage on her own." Claire straightened in her seat, a smile of surprise and gratitude on her face. "Are you serious?" I nodded. "Absolutely. You've shown your commitment to change. I think you deserve it." Martin smiled, taking my hand. "That sounds like a fantastic idea. And what about us?" I was thinking we could also start small, maybe take a family vacation. Nothing extravagant, just some time together to reconnect. Their eyes reflected understanding. It wasn't just about the money. It was about trust and taking small steps toward a better future. "I love that idea," Martin said, and Claire nodded in agreement. As we sat there, making modest but hopeful plans, I realized we had accomplished something extraordinary. We had taken something that could have destroyed us and turned it into a force for good growth. The money was still locked away in the trust, waiting. But it was no longer the center of our lives. It was a tool, a resource we would use wisely, with care and consideration. I looked at my family, the people I loved more than anything, and felt a deep sense of peace. We had been through fire, both literally and figuratively, and emerged stronger, more united. The future was uncertain, as it always is. But for the first time since I'd seen those winning numbers on TV, I felt we were truly ready to face it. Together, as a family richer not just in money, but in love, understanding, and wisdom. The months following the revelation of my plan brought profound transformation to our family. Spring in Valencia was in full bloom, and with it, it felt as if our lives were blossoming once more, free from the chains that money and mistrust had forged. One sunny April morning, I found myself sitting on the terrace of our new home, a modest but cozy house in the Razafa neighborhood with a small patio full of plants and flowers. From there, I could see the hustle and bustle of the street, neighbors coming and going, children playing in the nearby park. It was a familiar scene, yet for me it represented everything we'd achieved. Martin stepped out onto the terrace, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. He sat beside me and draped an arm around my shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, kissing my temple. I smiled and leaned into his embrace. "About everything and nothing," I replied. "About how much our lives have changed these past few months." And they had changed. After weeks of intensive therapy and long conversations, we'd come to an agreement on how to handle our unexpected fortune. First, we moved out of our old apartment, too laden with painful memories. This new house represented our fresh start. "You know," Martin said, interrupting my thoughts, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for how things turned out." I looked at him in surprise. "Really? Even with all the pain we went through?" He nodded, his gaze distant. "Yes, even with that. It forced us to face our fears and weaknesses. It made us grow." I couldn't help but agree. The journey had been tough, filled with moments of doubt and regret, but it had led us to a better place. At that moment, we heard the front door open and close. Claire joined us on the terrace, her face radiant with excitement. "I did it," she exclaimed, waving a piece of paper. "They approved my loan for the shop." We all got up to embrace her, sharing in her joy. Claire had decided to open a small bookstore specializing in local literature, a dream she'd had for years, but never had the courage or means to pursue. "We're so proud of you, Mom," Martin said, his eyes sparkling with emotion. And we truly were. Seeing Claire work so hard, taking business management classes, crafting a solid business plan all on her own, was inspiring. We had agreed to use a small portion of our money to help her start, but she insisted on securing a loan to cover most of the investment on her own merits. "This calls for a celebration," I declared as I headed to the kitchen. "I'm going to make paella for dinner." As I cooked, listening to Martin and Claire laughing and chatting in the living room, I reflected on how far we had come. After the unveiling of my plan, we'd endured a difficult adjustment period. There were moments of anger, of lingering resentment and doubt. But gradually, with our therapist's help and honest communication, we began to rebuild our relationship on a stronger foundation. We decided to use our money responsibly, prioritizing long-term stability over immediate luxuries. A large portion was invested in a diversified fund to ensure a steady income for the future. Another part was dedicated to charitable causes we cared about: education for underprivileged children, medical research, environmental protection. Martin decided to leave his factory job and go back to university. He'd always dreamed of becoming an engineer, but life had taken him on a different path. Now, at 35, he was finally pursuing that long-postponed dream. For my part, I discovered a passion for philanthropy. I started working part-time at a local foundation, helping channel resources into community projects, a work that filled me in ways I'd never experienced before. That evening's dinner was a celebration not only of Claire's achievement, but of everything we'd overcome as a family. As we ate paella and sipped wine, we reminisced about the hard times as well as the lessons we'd learned. "Remember when you guys wanted to open a chain of restaurants?" Claire joked, eliciting laughter around the table. Martin blushed slightly. God, what a crazy idea. We had no clue what we were talking about. "But look at us now," I said, raising my glass. Claire with her bookstore, Martin back at university, and me working at the foundation. "I think we've found our way." We toasted to new beginnings and hard-won lessons. After dinner, while Martin and Claire washed the dishes, insisting on doing it themselves as a token of gratitude, I stepped back out onto the terrace. The night was warm and clear, and the stars shone brightly overhead. I thought about how different my life was now from the night I'd seen those winning numbers on TV. Back then, I'd believed money would solve all our problems. Now I knew that money alone wasn't the answer. True wealth, I'd learned, lay in the relationships we'd strengthened, in the trust we'd rebuilt, in the personal growth we'd experienced. Money had given us options, yes, but it was our decisions, our hard work, and our mutual commitment that had truly transformed our lives. Martin came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. "Everything okay?" he asked softly. I turned in his embrace to look him in the eyes. "Absolutely," I replied sincerely. "You know," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I never properly thanked you for what you did. For protecting us from ourselves." Tears welled in my eyes. "You don't have to thank me. We're a family. We take care of each other." We stayed like that for a long moment, embracing under the stars, savoring the peace we had found. The next day, as we went to the bank to review our finances, a new ritual of transparency and responsible planning, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd come. Our bank manager, a kind man named Javier who had advised us from the start, congratulated us on our prudence. "It's refreshing to see people manage an unexpected fortune so responsibly," he commented. "Many in your situation would have blown half the money on needless luxuries." I exchanged a look with Martin, recalling how close we'd come to doing just that. "We've learned a lot," I said simply. After the bank, we visited the storefront Claire had chosen for her bookstore. It was a charming space on a quiet street in the old town, with large windows and wooden shelves reaching up to the ceiling. Claire guided us around, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she explained her plans. "Here I'll have a section for Valencian literature," she said, pointing to a cozy nook. "And over there, a children's reading area." Seeing her so passionate and purposeful filled me with indescribable joy. This was the Claire I'd always known beneath the surface, hidden by life's circumstances until now. "It's going to be a success," I assured her, giving her a warm hug. That afternoon, as we drove home, Martin took my hand. "You know," he said, "I think I finally understand what it means to be truly rich." I looked at him quizzically, and he continued, "It's not about the money in the bank. It's about this, having the freedom to chase our dreams, the ability to help others, the peace that comes from knowing we're doing the right thing." My heart swelled with love and pride. "You're absolutely right," I replied, squeezing his hand. That night, as I prepared for sleep, I reflected on everything we'd been through. The journey hadn't been easy. We'd faced betrayal, mistrust, and moments when everything seemed to be falling apart. Yet we had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united. I lay there, truly at peace for the first time in a long while, grateful for Martin, for Claire, and for the life we were building together. I knew the future would bring its own challenges, but I was confident we were ready to face them together as a family, free of the chains of our past and looking toward a future filled with possibilities. As sleep finally claimed me, one last thought crossed my mind. True wealth isn't measured in euros, but in love, personal growth, and the ability to do good. In that sense, we were immensely rich. With that comforting thought, I drifted off, grateful for the journey we'd embarked on and excited for what tomorrow might bring. Our new life, unburdened by the past, was just beginning.